In 1957, Congress and Dwight Eisenhower passed and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1959, but this didn't stick, forcing 60 African Americans, along with Martin Luther as the president, to form an organization of nonviolence. And eventually, the nonviolent paradigm traveled down to the youth via the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in South Carolina, I think. 1960, May 6th, Dwight Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1960, which was another win for voting rights because it was now frowned upon to use voter intimidation towards black voters. For each element of life, it rolled out in small intermediate steps, despite voter harassment being a thing that came with the Smith versus Allwright case. April 12, 1963, Dr. King and 50 other protesters demonstrated an awareness to Birmingham injustice via violence and segregation that Birmingham had. But they were jailed after violating protesting rules. Writing his letters from the Birmingham jail, arguing that anyone should speak out against legality, wrote Martin Luther King. Around this time, protests peaked in major cities. The civil rights movement of its strongest as 250,000 black and white people joined the Lincoln Memorial to advocate for jobs and more freedom. This is where Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech and spoke of white men being seen as equal and former slaves and slave owners sitting together at a table together as equals and not being judged by the color of their skin, essentially breaking apart the caste walls. Achieving this together, as Martin knew American politics tainted all people, not just the dominant class, but Martin likely could not separate himself from the rest of his fellow untouchables. It would take within 40 years before Martin's caste demolition to take fold in conceptual form. In 1953, James Watson, Francis Crick, Maurice Wilkins, and Rosalind Franklin all had their hand in discovering DNA, minus perceived threat against Franklin. But with DNA's doors open, human diseases could be tackled via gene mapping safely. Since during the eugenics movement in the 1920s and 1970s, it was taking advantage that there was ambiguous distinction between a medical issue and a personality type, as foreign things plus lack of education led to different forms of dehumanization. With the red carpet of DNA unfolding, it in a way was a victory for civil rights when in 1994 a massive study debunks the conception of race. This was not allowed to be a civil rights victory, though. In the 21st century, we expect physical characteristics for the most part to be off the table, whether it's identity, race, gender, etc., though nothing is as private as it seems when it comes to medical records. Legally assumed respect from big business. As the technology becomes more efficient and reliable, although we lost the surveillance war, certainly we have this sacred bodily autonomy on the inside, right? It might not be this simple. There is implied consensual attitudes that are claiming to work for us, though. 2008-2009 spelled this out for us when the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA for short, with many people asking Congress to work on the disparate impact issues, which Section 8 of GINA says it is not responsible for. In a PDF from Afoma Ajunwa, they point out 4 things that GINA does not cover. 1. The necessity of disparate impact knowledge as felt by a prior discrimination. 2. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission states that deliberate acts for people trying to steal the information is not considered a violation. 3. The likelihood of someone's information being leaked, thus affecting the job, increasing the genetic discrimination. 4. Real-world tests affect facial identity, despite non-genetic discrimination at first. 23andMe announced a while back that it was working with Pfizer Company to research ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and inflammatory bowel disease, which clearly sounds fine. Companies should be there for the people, if it was that simple. And don't forget Genentech, which is still open to data breach of business deals without customer consent. In 2010, after this woman, Pamela Fink, went through a double mastectomy, the BRCA2 mutation involved in breast cancer was very personal information at the time. But after this surgery, she was negatively reviewed at her job on a website, I assume. This anecdotal situation was a part of a greater statistic overall. Complaints have only ramped up in 2010. There was 201 complaints of discrimination, 245 issues in 2011, 280 complaints in 2012. 2013 and 2014 both experienced 333 complaints of genetic tampering. This obviously shows an increase going on against the greater public. We can easily say there is unreported claims, since people could be unaware of the law and the trust people have they should with these corporations, as post hoc naive as it may be. Hold on. Okay, this similar attitude of negligence is what caused the Black Panther Party to start up the People's Free Medical Clinics, which began by screening for sickle cell anemia, which generally affects African American descent. Although we know about sickle cell anemia since 1910, there was no support or funding from the broader population around the time when the eugenics movement was kicking off. The public's view on genetic determinism is that it's inevitable and hardwired without seriously taking the environment into account. This is not nature versus nurture. There isn't really a way to separate it aside from our bias and determinism ideas, seeing the components that turn into a dichotomy. But the relationship of genes and environment is an emergent property. The human bias is, of course, fed into the way discrimination unfolds by these companies and what algorithms pick up in the media, wrong or not. Deputy Chief of Staff for the Clinic of Veterinarians Administrator Paul R. Billings in 1997 raised the conceptual red flags, claiming genetic discrimination was already occurring in insurance and employment settings and was reaching into the areas of adoption and military service. DNA banks in the Department of Defense already produce serious problems, he says. In the book, The DNA Mystique, the author points out that DNA is a secular icon to the point of worship. What was meant to solve human mysteries turns into a divisive conspiracy, which was already using the existing bigotry in America since the beginning. The DNA Mystique states instead of piecing hereditary information together, it has become the key to human relationships and the basis of family cohesion. It has become a source of social difference. Instead of an important molecule, it has become a secular equivalent of the human soul. After the eugenics movement in America and the World War II victory, the discovery of the DNA and genetic surveillance could be a cold war over autonomy. And so with the power of essentialism, determinism, identity politics, this could unravel and could have ripped apart the purity-testing leftist community that understandably are in the right for social justice movements that have arisen. As the left eats itself alive, the fascist America right stand with their ropes, tiki torches, and beer guts watching the leftist carnage as our rights are stripped from us all. This is not a centrist fear I have, since the enemy is obvious. They're the ones with the flaming torches, obviously. The enemy is not about DNA, though. The policies are essentialist towards the model, but as we unify diversity, the DNA of the oppressor is the distraction. This story in the 2020s circles back to the civil rights movement. After George Floyd was murdered, this was another chapter of outrage that reached around the world, not just in American cities with Black Lives Matter protests, but reached out towards Tokyo, Australia, and Seoul. In the US, this caused the government to enact curfews in certain cities where roads were monitored by military vehicles. For a moment, there was mass unity to ask for change, for police reform. Policies were asked for, but the game of semantics over the euphemism of change the police, which at the time was defund the police, the details of what was asked for was only muddled as the language wasn't good enough. So this conversation was muddled into the background. For 6 years, progressive organizations, Intercept.com, there's this article about how social justice leaders and communities are actually infighting more than ever, which is actually a shame. Okay, for 6 years, progressive organizations have been facing internal pressures and infighting, especially in the age of handling empathy behind a screen rather than biological face-to-face, causing a disconnect amongst online communities who use Zoom and other FaceTime models of communication, like Twitter. Factions of human rights that advocate for issues in caste oppression, such as the Syria Club, Demos, the Sunrise Movement, Human Rights Campaign, have all begun infighting more often. As reported by Politico, quote, the 600,000-member National Audubon Society is confronting allegations that it maintains a culture of retaliation, fear, and antagonism towards people of color. End quote. Subcultures and sectarianism based on IDPOL has added up to 90% internal fighting with progressive movements, as opposed to what is usually seen as 25 to 30. The right have often used terms like cancel and call-out culture to describe leftist censorship. But when the left talks about infighting, they can't really go very far with it because the left and right criticism can overlap sometimes, and the purity testing of the left does not want to get wrapped up in language that's used to dog whistle that the right uses. The right used diversity to tokenize and weaponize by saying mixing culture works once but not today. Not only is this a lie, since diversity is a strength as told in a dream, but the problem is complex, and if the left does not have the answer, if the left is infighting, this diversity of the gaps is their weapon against the left. So they hold their head down in embarrassment while the right pass them with tiki torches.